Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, pretty much the second part thereof for the 11th of November 2024. This is a military aid segment. It will overlap to geopolitics and US politics necessarily because most of the conversation is going to be around whether the US continues to give aid to Ukraine and what Europe is doing about that. And there is so much to talk about in this video, so let's get on with it. Okay. First of all, we're going to go to the US in the present Biden administration, what's going on there. So we have the Kyiv Independent reporting that Biden is to urge Congress to send more aid to Ukraine in his last days of term. Quote, President Biden will have the opportunity over the next 70 days to make the case to the Congress that the United States should not walk away from Ukraine. To which Jakub Janowski from Oryx just says, in my opinion, Biden should send a lot more military aid to Ukraine, going way beyond what the Congress authorized, or just by minimizing the current value on various weapons, munitions and components. Now, I've heard this before. I think Colby Badwar's talked about this previously. It's just really hard to actually do that. There are formal ways you'd have to. Basically, that would be a form of corruption, really, that would be dodgy. However, I would justify doing that. I think that just as much stuff needs to go from the US to Ukraine as possible now, while it still can, because it will stop. It will stop. There is no doubt in my mind about that. Okay, so we've had John Kirby, US Strategic Communications Coordinator, emphasized that the priority is ensuring Kyiv wins the war against Russia. He said that the Biden administration is committed to ramping up support for Ukraine and is working on long-term security agreements. I wonder if there's some things that can be put in place that would be very hard to undo. Some kind of bilateral agreements. The problem is it's all about congressional approval, isn't it? But and as we'll find out a little bit later, Congress is going to be a very different place. So in fact, let's talk about that now, because I think it's really important to understand the context. When you had appropriations bills that got through Congress and the House, and you had overwhelming bipartisan support for the bills, you had a situation where many of the senators were old school senators, and you have Republicans in the House of Representatives that didn't feel they would have to be beholden to everything that Trump says, because Trump wasn't even in power, right? You effectively have Mitch McConnell in the Senate and Mike Johnson in the House of Representatives. And that's who people are answerable to, then to some degree taking on board that Trump's hanging around on the sidelines, just kind of dictating things. Trump will be president. And there will be this demand for everyone to follow suit, or you will get ejected from MAGA, the MAGA train. That's what happened before, and it's what's happened increasingly since 2014 to now. Like, even when Trump wasn't in power, you had this growing sense of kind of authoritarian diktats coming down from Trump, and this need to conform to his desires. So there are the new senators and lawmakers in the House of Representatives are very much more likely to be following Trump's direct orders. I don't think you will get the sort of bipartisan support in Congress for Ukraine that you saw previously. I think people will be too scared, or there'll be newcomers who are overtly anti-Ukraine for whatever weird reason. And Trump is not going to be passing down, I don't think there are going to be people generating bills to support Ukraine. Ukraine's funding will run out. And convince me otherwise, but by all means. But I know some of you who really like Trump, but also really like support for Ukraine, are just saying Trump's going to be amazing. But there's absolutely no data to suggest that at the moment. And it's looking like funding will run out. Unless you can show me some data points that support otherwise. So this is what Jake Sullivan, who I'm no big fan of, this is what he says as the Biden National Security Advisor.
President Biden made clear when President Zelensky was here in Washington a couple of months ago that we would spend all of the resources that were provided to us by the Congress on time and in full, meaning that by January 20th, we will have sent the full amount of resources and aid to Ukraine that Congress has authorized. And of course, President Biden will have the opportunity over the next 70 days to make the case to the Congress and to the incoming administration that the United States should not walk away from Ukraine, that walking away from Ukraine means more instability in Europe. And ultimately, as the Japanese prime minister said, If we walk away from Ukraine in Europe, the question about America's commitment to our allies in Asia will grow. President Biden.
Absolutely 100%. I completely agree with him there. But the actual chance of Biden convincing anyone in Congress with the state of affairs as it is, I'm going to show you some of the rhetoric that's going on at the moment. It is overtly anti-Ukraine. It's just that simple. Right, so let's talk about some stuff that the US is giving. So the US is sending Ukraine more than 500 interceptor missiles for Patriot and NASAMS air defense systems, according to the Wall Street Journal. Missiles will arrive in the coming weeks, should meet Ukraine's air defense needs by the end of this year. I don't know what meet their needs is, and what time frame that concerns. Reuters reports that the Pentagon is finally allowing US contractors to repair F-16s, Patriots and whatnot in Ukraine amid a major policy shift. It's a bit of a subtle one that's gone under the radar, I think, as everyone's talking about obviously the incoming Trump administration and talking about long distance missiles being fired, or missiles being fired very far into Russia. But actually, this is one of those changes that's really significant, and it puts US contractors, military industrial complex contractors, I would have thought, not kind of security or soldiers, inside Ukraine. So after months of relying on video calls and cross-border repairs, Ukraine will now host US defense contractors to service its growing arsenal of sophisticated Western weapons. The outgoing Biden administration has authorized contractors to maintain and repair Pentagon-supplied weapon systems, including F-16s and Patriots, marking a significant shift in US policy. While the US has provided Ukraine with tens of billions in military aid since Russia's 2022 invasion, maintenance of the equipment previously required moving systems out of the country or relying on remote assistance. The new policy aims to address the growing number of damaged, unused equipment and streamline repairs of increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. US officials speaking on condition of anonymity emphasised these contractors would be small in number, located far from combat zones, not engaged in combat operations, responsible for their own safety and risk management, operating without US military protection. The move aligns with the Pentagon with other US agencies, including State Department and USAID, which already have contractors in Ukraine. Officials noted that given the existing presence of American companies operating under Ukrainian government contracts, this change would not significantly increase a US civilian presence in the country. One official said they would help ensure US provided equipment can be rapidly repaired when damaged and be provided maintenance as needed. So it's a really critical point this comes at, and it's an important shift, and I hope that stays. I hope stuff like that just doesn't get undone just because by the incoming government. Okay, Pentagon officials told reporters the maintenance agreements would include Patriot systems. That is inaccurate, they now say, according to Alex Horton. Repairs will focus on air defense systems broadly. And why not another update? In addition to F-16s and air defense systems, contractors will focus on repairing Bradleys and other complex systems, the Pentagon says. So actually, I was a bit confused by the initial phrasing there, but I think it does mean it will include Patriot systems and all air defense systems and Bradleys and other stuff as well. So it's really good news there. Now, Ukraine is to receive, we'll go on to talk about what the incoming administration appears to be signalling and the impact that's going to have on Europe and obviously US support for Ukraine in a wee while. But let's just look at other bits and pieces. A $1.37 billion grant from the World Bank is going to Ukraine. Peace in Ukraine project is a World Bank's initiative that provides financial support to Ukraine's state budget, targeting social and humanitarian expenditures not related to security and defence. So that's good, keeps the lights on. The EU is preparing for the 15th sanctions package against Russia, targeting foreign-made parts. I'm including this in military aid because it's about the production of weaponry. So the EU is readying the 15th package of sanctions against Russia, targeting foreign-made components found in Russian weaponry, the EU's top diplomat Joseph Borrell, who is in Kiev at the moment, has said. Now, this is French aid to Ukraine reporting Natalie Loiseau, who is saying Deputy Européen, so European Deputy, the Horizons Le Parti. So anyway, she says the money needed to support Ukraine is there. It is Russian and it is in European banks. Let's take the money from the aggressor to support the victim. Enough talk, time for action. So there is this growing move. There's some growing rhetoric regarding, I think, the giving over of the Russian frozen assets, not just creaming off the profits. And of course, that might upset other loan situations put in place that are being underwritten by the profits. If you then say, well, let's give $300 billion worth of frozen assets directly to Ukraine, then actually those profits will be, you couldn't use the profits to pay back the loan. So there might be a little bit of a tension going on there. Now, advanced Ukrainian M777 howitzer decoys, which simulate a shot from the barrel. So they've got like fake smoke coming out of the barrel, simulating an imagined, or simulating a firing of the howitzer, just to give an added, I mean, it doesn't look particularly impressive, does it? I think you need a bit more of a puff than that. But they're trying to obviously simulate real howitzers to make them even more attractive for Russian drones and missiles. Now, here we have the flagship of the Ukrainian fleet, the Corvette Ivan Mazepa, conducting tests of artillery attack systems. The commander of the Navy, Neij Papa, stated the Corvette excellently fired at sea, land and air targets. I'm not 100% sure what these corvettes are going to be used for, to be perfectly frank. They're in the Black Sea in Turkish waters because they've been constructed by the Turks. But I don't know how the Ukrainians are going to use these, because as soon as you put them out into the Black Sea and give them to Ukrainians, they're just going to be target number one for the Russians. So I wonder whether they'll just be shipped outside of the Black Sea initially, or kept in a Turkish port inside the Black Sea. They might be used to escort ships down the grain corridor, but I just think they'll be huge magnets for Russian attention. Now, listen to Michael Kaufman on Russia Contingency podcast. Here's a quote, says Shashank Joshi, the defense editor for The Economist. So drones don't necessarily replace artillery, says Kaufman, but it's a very significant means of inflicting attrition on Russian forces and stopping mechanized advances. Drones have gotten a lot better at stopping mechanized advances. So Kaufman on interceptor FPVs, quote, Ukraine is starting to compensate for lack of short-range air defense with drones. They've substantially increased drone production, and probably right now Ukraine has both an advantage in the numbers of drones produced and the overall quality. And the last point, Kaufman points to a growing stabilization in terms of Ukrainian air defense munitions, though not launchers. With the situation less dire than before, resilience of the Ukrainian power grid will depend on weather. He says Russia Shahed strikes are up, but notable percentage are decoys and mapping drones. So that's interesting. So not all of them are loaded with warheads. So that is fascinating. Worth knowing that, actually, because I always talk about what goes up must come down and think there's always an explosion afterwards. But actually, a lot of them are decoys and mapping drones, which are trying to do their job of either getting the Ukrainians to attrit their own air defense interceptors, or mapping for intelligence. Right, so the Vampire heavy bomber drone here, known as a Baba Yaga, survived a direct hit from a Russian FPV drone thanks to dynamic armor repurposed from a tank. So it might have some kind of explosive reactive armor put on it that explodes the drone away from it, and the Baba Yaga survived that attack from an FPV drone. That's incredible. Right, a recent poll indicates that 74.2% of South Koreans oppose providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, while only 24.5% are in favour. Any suggestion of a more significant military commitment could deal a critical blow to the incumbent administration. In other words, it's going to be difficult to convince the South Koreans that they should be providing weapons directly to Ukraine, because the general public doesn't seem to be too in favour. They come under quite a lot of American pressure, South Korea, and yeah, I wonder whether there's an awful lot of disinformation going around there. Some point to the potential contravention of domestic laws and regulations on military readiness, such as the requirement to maintain an ammunition stockpile sufficient for at least 60 days. More defensive assets, and this is coming from the Royal United Services Institute article. More defensive assets such as Cheonggung anti-air interception system would likely be considered first if Seoul decides to provide any weapons to Ukraine. The possibility of providing offensive weapons is low, so it's more likely to get air defense than actual weapons that are offensive, which wouldn't surprise me. I was expecting more in terms of artillery, ammunition, shell stockpiles. Okay. This is exceptionally good news for the Ukrainians. Zelensky has said that Ukraine has produced their first 100 missile weapons. Over 800 Ukrainian companies are now engaged in weapons production for the country's defense forces, Zelensky revealed on the 9th. So I would hope that this means we are going to start seeing some strikes, and maybe they're happening and we're just not hearing about them. Those kind of strikes, you generally have to, so say they send a missile, I don't know, 600 kilometers into Russia and explodes at some out the way ammunition depot or out the way defense concern, then you're only going to hear about that if someone puts it on social media. So I wonder if there have been some missiles used by the Ukrainians that we simply don't know about. Same goes with drones, to be perfectly honest. Right, now we're going to get on to the meaty stuff, because although I have to say 100 missiles being created by them is fantastic, I'm going to play you the beginning to this. Right, we're going to be talking about where the US appears to be going with their support for Ukraine or lack of support for Ukraine, and what Europe are doing in answer to that, and whether the question is going to be if they are doing something, if they are stepping into the vacuum that the US will leave, then will that be enough? Will Europe be able to replace American support? I think for me, it seems a foregone conclusion that the US will pull support from Ukraine. And if you believe otherwise, show me how that's the case, since all the rhetoric and all the appointments are not looking good. So here is the GOP Senator Haggerty taking saying we need to stop the carnage in Ukraine.
And we turn now to Tennessee Republican Senator Bill Haggerty, who also served as U.S. Ambassador to Japan during the first Trump administration. It's good to have you here.
It's good to be with you.
So Donald Trump has this sweeping mandate, as do Republicans. Do you see this as an unrestrained presidency?
I think this is a presidency that has a mandate like we haven't seen, as you mentioned, in 36 years. The American public has spoken loud and clear. And I think if you go back to your interview with Bob, there are a number of places where Washington has been out of touch with the American people. You mentioned Ukraine. I think
before he goes on, he's just said Washington's been out of touch with the American people. Polls consistently show that the American people support the US's support of Ukraine. So actually, they're not out of touch. Arguably, the MAGA position on Ukraine is out of touch with the American people. That may be changing now that they are blasting the airwaves with anti-Ukraine narrative, and it's coming from the top. I think people are going to be changing their opinion. But actually, what he's stating there is empirically not correct.
I think that's a great example. The American people want sovereignty protected here in America before we spend our funds and resources protecting the sovereignty of another nation. You think about it. We've sent $175 billion of U.S. aid to Ukraine. That's more than 3 times the entire annual budget of the U.S. Marine Corps. I've been one of the few senators in the United States Senate who has voted and has opposed every cent of this Ukraine aid. Right. I've been listening to the American people. We need to focus on our own issues first. And I've taken a lot of heat over it from Mitch McConnell, from the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. But this is what the American people spoke up and want us to do. We should never have been in Ukraine.
You are not in Ukraine. You are supporting Ukraine. You know, you support lots of countries around the world. You're not in them.
As a result of failed policies, failed energy policies, the failure in Afghanistan.
There's no U.S. presence in Ukraine.
No, but our funds, I'm talking about the vast amount of funds. Again, $175 billion is a tremendous amount, as I said, more than 3 times the budget of the U.S. Marine Corps. The American people want to focus on fixing our problems here. And with the borders collapsed, with crime in the cities, we've got to pay attention to America.
So does that mean just cuts to U.S. military aid to all countries?
What it means is that we need to take a very deliberate focus on America first. And we need to be leading from a position of strength, Margaret. As I said, we would not be in this position. Now what we have is an administration that's allowing Russia to sell at a $60 a barrel cap. Mm-hmm. The argument they make that reduces Russia's profits. What it does actually is it subsidizes China to compete again unfairly against us with an energy cost advantage. Right. And we keep Vladimir Putin fully funding this war in Ukraine. We need to stop that. We need to go back to producing our own energy and take Russia out. Interestingly, I'll call this the Trump effect. But just in the past 72 hours, what we've seen is the EU say maybe we should replace Russian LNG with U.S. LNG. You've seen in New York City We're not going to issue debit cards to illegal immigrants anymore. Migrant caravans are being broken up below the border and turned around. The UK has said we're going to step our defense budget up to about 2.5%, all since President Trump was elected.
Some of that was in process already, but let me ask you specifically on Ukraine.
So, and we will listen a bit more to this, but that $175 billion, as the Council for Foreign Relations says, it's important to note the $175 billion total, that's often, so they talk about, that's often cited by news media. Only $106 billion directly aids the government of Ukraine. Most of the remainder is funding various US activities associated with the war in Ukraine, and a small portion goes to other affected countries in the region. So it is a lot more nuanced than he is stating.
Right. So Hungary's prime minister has said that Donald Trump has told him he will cut off support to Ukraine. You are saying here, I think, in the new Congress, there will be no more aid to Ukraine.
I've certainly not voted for any aid.
I know
to
you
Ukraine.
haven't.
And I think President Trump will find,
is that the mandate?
President Trump will find a way to deal with this. I'm not going to get ahead of him. I'm certain that he's going to find a way to navigate this that's in the interest of the American people and will stop the carnage. Look, what's happened in Ukraine is terrible. People are dying. They continue to die.
But
we need to stop this.
But here's the thing. We
need to stop this by stopping funding going to Ukraine, forcing them to negotiate, and we're going to talk about this in a second because there have been phone calls that haven't involved Zelensky, forcing them to negotiate and then ceding their territory, and that we need to stop the carnage in Ukraine is another way of saying we need to give Russia what they want. That's my opinion, and I will stand by it, and I don't like this man.
Also are seeing this alignment of like an axis of adversaries, right? You have Iranian equipment, you have Chinese
Deeply
equipment.
Concerning, yes.
Right. You have North Korean personnel on the battlefield. So this idea that Ukraine is somehow divorced from the rest of geopolitics doesn't seem to be bearing out. It's of deep concern to some.
High five. Great question.
Some of our Asian allies,
Point.
Japan, South Korea. So how are you going to be able to do this without complicating the chessboard?
Well, I think it's become complicated because America has not been standing in a position of strength. The reason is that Russia has been fully funded because of the policies that allowed them to sell energy.
Well,
Iran, we had them shut down. Iran was
Russia,
broke.
whether or not
Now they're able to fund terror all over the world. We had a maximum pressure campaign.
Because they have all these other adversaries that they're doing business with, right?
They were not able to do that under the Trump administration. That's why we saw peace breaking out in the Middle East.
That's absolute bollocks, right? Honestly, they weren't allowed to do that. They weren't what? They weren't allowed to trade oil with Russia and with China and India. What are you talking about? He's lying. He's lying. Or he's just not making any sense. Oh, they weren't allowed to do that. What? Do what? Trade, get money from other nations? But they are now. They've got sanctions now. So China and India are stopping doing that precisely because the Treasury's put sanctions on. This is outright disinformation.
Without Iran being shut down, which is what we did under the maximum pressure campaign, President Trump led this. We were able to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Everybody said it couldn't happen. It did. Yeah. The Abraham Accords, peace was breaking out in the Middle East because Iran could not fund terror. As soon as the Biden administration came in, they stopped enforcing the sanctions.
There were attacks by Iran during the Trump administration.
Nothing to the level that we've seen.
And the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. But on the Middle East, Israel's prime.
And then goes on to Middle East. But I just does my nut in that is a complete distortion of reality. So we're trying to get up a sense of whether the US is going to continue giving aid to Ukraine. We have Donald Trump's son says Zelensky will lose his allowance when his father takes office. On Instagram, Donald Trump Jr. shared a video of dollars falling on the Ukrainian president with the caption, "You're 38 days from losing your allowance." And that is POV, point of view, you're 38 days from losing your allowance. So that is Donald Trump Jr. very clearly saying that Ukraine will not get any funding from the US, from Trump. Now, you can dismiss that and say, well, isn't that what he's talking about? Or you can say, actually, it fits in line with what everyone is talking about. So the senator, that's in line with what the senator said. It's in line with what Trump himself has said. It's in line with what all the people involved in the US incoming administration have said. Anyone of note. Ilya Ponomarenko talks about David Sachs. So David Sachs is part of this tech bro oligarchy that appears to be on track to run the US government. So you've got Elon Musk, Peter Thiel and David Sachs, these three South African billionaires who are all anti-Ukraine and who are all have their fingers in all the American political pies concerning the incoming administration. David Sachs says the smart people know the Ukraine war is a gift and they are in on it. The dumb people think it's about democracy, even though the vast majority of Crimea and Donbass are ethnic Russians and want to go with Russia. The US has been fighting democracy in Ukraine. Right, David Sachs says that, and Ilya Ponomarenko, rightfully, so the Ukrainian author and former Kyiv independent journalist, says, what's especially beautiful is that this moneybag, who could never point Ukraine out on a map, is now telling me, a guy from the Donbass, and my community, that we are actually ethnic Russians and want to go with Russia. There's not a single drop of intellectual humility or sticking to the fact that the world could not be that simplistic. Maybe it's that you have no idea what you're talking about, and that the vast majority of ethnic Russians who actually identified themselves as Russian-speaking Ukrainians don't want to have anything in common with Putin's totalitarian hellhole, especially following terrible devastation that Russia brought upon Ukraine's south and east, where it swept off entire cities and regions. Maybe it's that, especially given the catastrophe of 2022, even more Eastern Ukrainians chose Ukraine and the West. So that's why they fled the war or settled down in other parts of Ukraine or in Europe. Or maybe this is why a very large part of the Ukrainian military at war is the people of Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Odessa, Mykolaiv and Kherson, who hate Russia and fight it fiercely, knowing what it has done to their homeland and their own families. How many men and women of Mariupol fight to have their revenge and defend the country from the plague of Russian fascism, next to the ones who lost their loved ones in Russian missile attacks on Lviv? How many so-called ethnic Russians who have always identified themselves as Ukrainians now stay in free Ukraine, work jobs, pay taxes, run charities and send donations to buy drones and take care of disabled veterans? How many want to live in freedom, dignity, democracy and pursuit of happiness too? But David Sachs in his infinite arrogance and ignorance thinks he knows better. And these are the people informing the discourse in the cloisters of power to be. David Sachs again says, audit Ukraine. And someone says back to him, one of his lackeys, 100%, we need to see footage from the Middle East war, but never. So why do we see footage from the Middle East war, but never anything from Ukraine? To which War Translators says this is an insane level of discourse. So you've got David Sachs talking about Ukraine being audited and casting aspersions on Ukraine and wanting funding to stop going to Ukraine. You've got someone else in that information space saying, God, we never see footage coming out from the Ukraine war. Why? And we only ever see stuff from the Middle East war. Look in the right places. Jesus, mate, I do that all day. I fight hard not to show you stuff because it's so freaking inappropriate for YouTube, etc., etc. Like, there is so much footage out there, it blows the mind. How can you say you never see anything on Ukraine? It's because you're not looking and you live in a different information space. And these are the people casting opinions on the war in Ukraine. And these are the sorts of people who are putting pressure on Trump not to aid Ukraine. This is not looking good for Ukraine at all. So Oliver Carroll here from the Economist says both Zelensky and Putin believe the personal factor will help with Trump. That isn't surprising. Trump's character has overlap with both of them. He's a disruptor, a showman and a postmodern autocrat. The worrying thing for Ukraine is Russia has better lobbying, and that will probably prove more decisive. In other words, if you're thinking, I can appeal to Trump's personality here, his ego, his narcissism, the fact he's a showman, all this kind of stuff, both Putin and Zelensky are thinking that. But Zelensky's lobbying department is nothing. I mean, you've just heard Haggerty, the senator. We know that Donald Trump Jr., we know Elon Musk, like trying to lobby through all that. Russia had the edge there massively. Absolutely massively. And then if you're thinking, okay, but he's going to put sensible people in place, he's got every chance to do that. He's already announced publicly, he said, I will not be inviting former Ambassador Nikki Haley or former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to join the Trump administration, which is currently in formation. I very much enjoyed and appreciated working with them previously and would like to thank them for their service to the country. Make America great again. The two people that had any support for Ukraine have now been jettisoned. I can't think of anyone that he's putting in place at the moment that I've heard about that has any support for Ukraine at all. Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo won't join the Trump administration. President-elect Trump expressed his gratitude, but said no, thank you, sirree. And as this source says it all, just now he's gradually axing every Republican who wants to support Ukraine. Mitch McConnell won't be the speaker of the majority speaker in the Senate, and you got Mike Johnson who will say whatever Trump wants him to say. So as Kraut says here, I told you so. Everything that we're warning, people like myself were warning about the upcoming Trump administration appears to be happening. Julia Davis says, lol, the insane timeline is back with a vengeance. So this is kind of different claims and counterclaims. So you've got this idea that Putin and Trump have been in telephone contact. Zelensky's got annoyed because he wasn't part of that they are signing away Ukraine's future bilaterally. We've had, in this last week, Europeans very clearly say we can't have peace accords or peace negotiations without considering what they want, what the people whose country's been fricking invaded want. But no, let's just have conversations to dictate the future of Ukraine without Ukraine in that conversation. So telephone call, what telephone call? Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has denied reports in the US that Putin spoke to Trump last week. Quote, it doesn't correspond at all to reality. It's completely made up. It's false information. There was no conversation. And that's Julie Davis saying the insane timeline is back. In other words, we're into this period of everyone denying, not knowing, no one knows what's going on. It's just all duplicitous. I'm so... Euromaidan Press reports that the Kremlin has denied, Putin-Trump phone call that the Washington Post reported took place. Ukraine's foreign ministry denied another part of Washington Post report that Ukraine was allegedly informed of the call beforehand. Trump's team said they don't comment on private calls. So Ukraine had come out and said, no, we weren't. So they denied that and they're not happy about it. So anyway, that all aside, that kind of mess aside, the question, okay, what are the main players in Europe doing about this? What is Europe doing about this at large? What's the EU doing about this? So Poland is seeking to form a strong alliance with Britain and other key EU nations to prevent, key EU nations to prevent any potential sellout of Ukraine if Trump takes the White House. So this has been reported in the Times. Poland seeks British help to protect Ukraine after a Trump win. Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, will hold talks with the leaders of Britain, France and NATO over concerns about the US election, the impact of it. The Polish Prime Minister will meet France's President, Britain's Prime Minister and the head of NATO and leaders of Nordic and Baltic states soon to discuss transatlantic cooperation and the war in Ukraine, he said on Saturday. Now, interestingly, there was a report in The Guardian saying relations between Ukraine and UK are worse under Labour, according to Kyiv officials. So Zelensky administration expresses frustration with Starmer over lack of missiles. But as we're hearing, that is not the UK's fault, as far as I understand it. It's the US's fault, which is why they are lobbying the US for permission to use them. And so this is just absolute cluster munition explosion of confusion going on with regard to these missiles. Ukraine's relationship with the UK got worse since the Labour government took power in July. Officials in Kyiv told The Guardian, voicing frustrations over Britain's failure to supply additional long-range missiles. UK Prime Minister is yet to visit Ukraine 4 months after taking office, and a frustrated Kyiv said that a trip would be worthless unless Keir Starmer committed to replenishing stocks of sought-after long-range Storm Shadow systems. So there is lots of people talking about this. No, do I have it? No. Saying that's a dangerous game to play in terms of... No, I haven't got it. I think it was Shashan Joshi saying it's a dangerous game to play to start having a go at the UK and saying that there's no point having a meeting unless you're going to bring these missiles. And actually, there are other things happening concerning those missiles, and it seems to be concerning the US permission. But also, there is a discussion about construction of these missiles, and the problem is these are being replaced, and it's just insane to start rebuilding these missiles, because you'd have to get the whole production back up for a missile that you're phasing out, that you've already basically phased out. So it's just not plausible to have done that. I initially thought, they should have been building these, but given the wider context of the missile replacement, you can understand why they decided not to order and build huge amounts of missiles that would require massive investment that would end up not returning to that investment, giving you a return on investment, given that the production would then stop in like a year's time anyway. Zelensky said there's no point coming in as a tourist. Ouch. Ukraine is growing increasingly unhappy with London as Russian troops advance to the east of the country at their fastest rate since 2022. So this is a bit of a doomer article. Officials said it isn't happening. Starmer isn't giving us long-range weapons. The situation is not the same as when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. The relationship has got worse. Sunak visited Kyiv in November 2022. Within a month of becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, his predecessor but one, enjoyed a close relationship with Zelensky and was considered by Ukraine a critical source of support shortly after Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February. And then the rest goes on to talk about sort of storm shadows and whatnot before getting back to, they have met. They've met a number of times, and actually they've had good meetings. So I don't know exactly how accurate this is. And Keir Starmer's rhetoric has been very good in support of Ukraine, but of course, whether there's a difference in rhetoric and reality is a different matter. Starmer met Zelensky on Thursday at the European Political Summit in Budapest. The Prime Minister said UK support for Ukraine was unwavering and acknowledged we need to step up. It's very important that we stand with you. So the rhetoric's there. An important element of the victory plan is providing Ukraine with long-range weaponry and granting permission to use it against military targets on Russian territory, said Zelensky. Privately, sources in Kiev complained that the meeting in Hungary led to, quote, no progress at all on the missile issue. Until deliveries of Storm Shadow resumed, there was little point in Starmer travelling to Kiev. They added, we have been discussing since August a possible visit by Starmer. Various dates have come and gone. Starmer has postponed several times, the official said. They added, there's no point in him coming as a tourist. At that moment, he's not willing to take the decisions that are necessary. Downing Street said the UK support for Ukraine is ironclad and that Starmer has been clear that the government would stand with Ukraine for as long as it took, emphasising the number of meetings between the two leaders since Labour took power in July. So they have actually met a load of times. So Zelensky's been to the UK. There have been several different events on there. And they've met in Europe other times as well. Number 10 spokesman said one of the Prime Minister's first decisions in office was to commit to spending £3 billion of support for Ukraine every year. And since then, the Prime Minister's met Zelensky 6 times, including hosting him at Number 10 twice and meeting him at the European Political Community meeting in Hungary this week. Britain's the third largest donor of military equipment after the US and Germany. The total committed by the UK since 2022 has been £12.8 billion, of which £5 billion in financial and humanitarian support and £7 billion in military aid. So on and so forth. Now, we then get on to this very important piece of news. On Friday, Keir Starmer appointed Tony Blair's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, as National Security Advisor. Powell has long advocated negotiating with enemies to bring about peace, prompting one Ukraine expert and Labour historian to argue that he might add to pressure on Kyiv to negotiate a truce with Russia. Brian Brevati, a former director of the John Smith Trust, said, quote, of course, there has to be a deal at some point, but for Trump and Powell, it is the end of fighting that counts, which is not the same as peace. Now, there are others. So I was listening to so let's bring this in. Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell are saying, actually, this is a really good appointment. This guy is very experienced and knows his stuff. Jonathan Powell, according to Financial Times, so Tony Blair's former chief of staff and an architect of the Northern Ireland peace process, is to become Sir Keir Starmer's new national security advisor, according to people familiar with the matter. So you might argue, you could be justified in arguing this is a guy that you're going to put in place if there's peace needing to be negotiated. I think this is probably covering both bases, which is like if Trump forces peace and Zelensky goes towards peace, then we need someone that's used to negotiating really tricky peace processes. And the Northern Ireland peace process was a very tricky one. So he's got experience in all of these matters. But if peace is not going to be forced upon Ukraine, then this is still a really good, competent appointment. Now, The Telegraph is reporting that UK Prime Minister Starmer will announce an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP to improve relations with Trump. I don't know this is in order to improve relations with Trump. I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. There's no way we commit to 2.5% of GDP expenditure on defense just to please Trump. That's a load of bollocks. I'm sorry. That is giving Trump way more credit than he's due. That will be as a result of 2.5 years of this war and our military strategy changing as a direct result of that, and everyone in Eastern Europe and in Europe in general going, oh my goodness, we need to spend more on defense. With America pulling out, we're going to need to spend more on defense, etc., etc. So I think that is maybe how the Telegraph want to paint that, but it's almost certainly not the case. Currently, UK defence spending is about 2.2% of GDP, with an increase expected to be announced in the spring. I mean, that is a big old change in expenditure there. Now, moving on, Noel reports that France will send a new batch of around 10 long-range SCALP EG cruise missiles and Mistral air defence missiles to Ukraine soon, according to French Minister of the Armed Forces, Patriot and NASAMS. 10 cruise missiles, says Yoni Ascola. Nearly 3 years have passed and France, the UK and Italy haven't considered resuming production of these missiles, leaving them very few to send. How can we expect these fools to replace the US and Ukraine? Pathetic. I go back to, I think it's more, so if they were producing, this is just really bad timing. So if they were still producing Storm Shadow missiles, if they had production lines up, then I think we'd be producing loads of Storm Shadow missiles. And if we were producing the new missile, we would just be producing more of them for Ukraine. But neither is happening. We're in this, unfortunately, in this period between missiles where we had enough stockpiles of the old missiles to make sure that we'd be all right until the new missiles came along. And then suddenly a war took place and we started giving Storm Shadows and Scouts away. And actually we're not making them anymore. And we're unlikely to resurrect that production line. So I don't know. There is the principle of someone like Yoni Ascola and myself, like I've said this earlier, why the hell are we not producing these missiles? There's that simplistic approach to, we should just be doing this. And then there's the actual practical, pragmatic reality of the world whereby, well, we need to put a contract in with them and they're unlikely to sign, like, if it's made by MBDA, right, MBDNA, whatever, that company, and you put in your order with them, say, right, we want another 200 missiles, and they say, well, we're not going to do that because it's only worth us resurrecting this production line if you're going to put in 400 missile orders every year for the next 6 years or something like that, right? So I'm making those numbers up, but you get the point. It's like, well, then the UK goes, well, we're not going to do that. That's an obscenely large amount of missiles that we can't justify. And so the company goes, well, okay, we're not going to resurrect that. We're going to wait till the next missile line is up and running. That's probably more accurately what's going on. French aid to Ukraine says, we need to, Sébastien Lecornu, this is reported by French aid to Ukraine. Sébastien Lecornu, the defense minister of France, says, we need to sustain our assistance over the long term, as this will also enable the Ukrainian authorities to consider political solutions when they decide to do so. Military support is essential. Even when the war is over, we must continue to strengthen the Ukrainian army. First, we will continue the unprecedented training program in eastern France, where 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers are being trained in brigades by French soldiers using French equipment. Second, we will maintain our assistance. With the onset of winter, Russia's deep strikes on Ukrainian territory are likely to intensify. We will resume deliveries of Mistral missiles, in particular to protect combat zones, to enable Ukraine to carry out strikes behind front line. I've recently signed a new transfer of a dozen SCALP missiles, as promised by the President of the Republic to Volodymyr Zelensky. So you're going to get about a dozen SCALP EG missiles. Obviously, you could use them in a day, really. Need a load more than that, but better than a hot poker up the posterior. General de Gaulle already explained that Europe was naive to delegate its security to the United States and rejected this model for France. Let's think further and put ourselves in the shoes of the Americans. Should the taxpayers of Arizona or Nevada fund the security of the Poles or the Germans? I think this is a problematic way of framing this, because my argument has long been America's not protecting Europe for charity, right? They're not there to help Europe as a form of like being nice neighbours in the world. This is because it's in their strategic interest to do so. Like, this is the Cold War. This is a new version of the Cold War where it's become slightly hot. And the US being involved in European stability and security is a decision they have made because it fulfills their strategic geopolitical objectives. So taxpayers of Arizona and Nevada funding US military activities in Europe is funding the US desire to stay at the top of the hegemonic ladder. It's that investment you have to put in the rest of the world in order to get the return on investment for being the number one player on the world stage. Now, if they move out of Europe, then that is accepting that now Europe are a player on the world stage, but it's also doing the opposite of flexing, whatever that would be. They are unflexing in the full sight of China and Russia and India and Brazil. It's like, we are receding, we're not getting involved in Europe, and it's that isolationism that will lose the US influence on the global chess game. So I think that framing is problematic. I can see why I'd say that from a French point of view if they don't want the Americans to be playing such a major role. In a coherent global organisation and in the face of new threats, it is normal for Europeans to take responsibility for their own security. It is a battle that the President of the Republic has been waging since 2017. With its nuclear deterrent, its professional army and its sovereign defence industry, France has developed a unique model. This model should now inspire other European countries. Each country must continue to strengthen its military capabilities, both by increasing its budget and by having fully operational armed forces. Poland should turn more to France than to the United States. It's not an opportunity, it's a necessity. If Poland chooses to buy certain weapons not from the United States but from South Korea, where the industries produce and deliver more quickly, this is an important change. Now you're starting to see a little bit of a clever play here by France. And this goes in line with the European defence strategy, which says 60% of the procurement should come from within inside the EU. And it's like I talk about all the time. If the US pulls out of Europe and says you need to stand on your own 2 feet, then the US will not receive orders for its munitions and military equipment to the degree it used to. If you're saying you need to stand on your own 2 feet, then start standing on your own 2 feet is buying within Europe, mutually supporting each other, not needing the US either in terms of personnel or in terms of equipment, and even questioning whether you should be buying from South Korea, but that's a change and a step away from the US anyway. And then can we take on that South Korean model where South Korea build the stuff and then you can build it in your own country under license? Can we learn from that? France is positioning itself because it's the second biggest arms exporter in the world, France. So there will be an element of economic and industrial strategy going on from France's rhetoric here in terms of being happy that the US recedes into its own kind of isolationism. So this is not good news for France, but there are things that are changing too. For example, the Poles decided to buy French satellites from Airbus. So he's saying buying from South Korea is not as good as buying from France, but you are starting to get some stuff from us. It's vital that our defence industry continues its efforts to innovate, but also to produce faster. It's also a necessity for the needs of our own army. So one thing the South Koreans do is build stuff really quickly, and partly because they're used to doing that by being at war effectively for so long that they just got a very efficient and reactive arms industry. Now, France is due to deliver 600 end-of-life AASM bombs, modular air-to-ground weapons. These are the guided glide bombs. They were producing or providing 50 a month to Ukraine. I don't know if that's gone up since then, but another 600, it was basically the year's worth that they previously provided. So that's another year's worth on those levels of 50 a month to the Ukrainian armed forces by the end of 2024. Wow. So that's that's like the whole year's worth now, or another year's worth now in just a couple of months. And production of AASM bombs needs to be stepped up significantly in order to replenish the Air Force stocks with new ammunition, the French Air Force. The Ministry of the Armed Forces is now aiming to produce 1,200 bombs by 2025. I presume that's per year. So that is incredibly important. But actually, we're going to rewind a little bit here and look at some claims to do with the Air Force as well. or the planes. MP Frank Giletti has revealed that France will soon deliver 6 Mirage 2005F to the Ukrainian armed forces with a full support model. These transfers of Mirage 2000-5 will lead to a postponement of the activity of the fleet of renovated Rafale and Mirage 2000D, with the risk of the inevitable increase in MCO costs and a deterioration in their availability. They will also accelerate, subject to all reservations, the withdrawal from operational service of the Mirage 2000-5. In the short term, the forthcoming transfer of 6 Mirage 2000-5s to the Ukrainian armed forces and the associated comprehensive support model will further impoverish the narrowly tailored format of our fighter. The number is clearly insufficient, says French aid to Ukraine, but this transfer represents 23.07% of the Mirage 2005F fleet and will affect the operational capabilities of the Air Force, which will not wait for the replacement of these capabilities to transfer the M2005F to Ukraine. So the way I understand that is they're giving France are giving these 6 planes to Ukraine without having replacements, so it will leave France somewhat compromised in their own air defense capacity, but good for Ukraine, right? So they're going to get 6 fully operational Mirages that are coming with a support package. Now, Denmark is showing their full support for Ukraine. Ukraine's defense sector received $600.6 million as a boost from Denmark. The deals will bolster Ukraine's weapons production for its army. So this is again the kind of Danish model where Denmark is investing in Ukrainian defense production, focusing on self-propelled artillery, drones and anti-tank systems and missiles. Missiles is going to be the key one as far as I'm concerned. So Denmark really stepping up there. And this is really good news from Norway. So Norway's largest party, Høyre, if that's how you pronounce it, wants to triple funding to Ukraine next year, up from 15 billion kroner government proposal to 45 billion kroner, 3.82 billion euros. The most will go to strengthen Ukraine's own defense industry. So that's very much in line with what Denmark is doing. So what does someone say here? That's 2% of how much Norway reportedly gained in 2022 to 2023 from the higher energy prices due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No wonder Europe is a soft target for Russia. Lucky countries like Norway, Switzerland and Ireland partake minimally while Ukraine, Poland and Baltics pay. Interesting. So someone saying actually you can afford to do so. They are obviously a big oil producer, so oil prices going up would have helped them out a lot. And this is why people like Stephen Bandal, I need to have a chat to him, but he's one of my viewers, says that actually, although I'm happy with what Ukraine does when they make these big, give these big packages to Ukraine, I'm happy with what Norway does, actually they could do a lot more. So there are a lot of Norwegians say, yeah, that's great, but we could do loads more. And here, actually, you've got the largest party. I think this is a Conservative opposition party. But anyway, that is really good news for Ukraine. That when you start getting, this is very different from the US, where Ukraine's become partisan. It's become so partisan, it's ridiculous. Whereas in the UK and Norway and other countries in Europe, there is, not all countries, because you have the AfD and BSW and the Linke in Germany, you've got Rassemblement National in France, but in many countries there is bipartisan support for Ukraine because it's obviously should be a sensible option for those who take time to understand these matters. Anyway, that's enough from me. Really big one today because of the nature of what's going on in the US. Remember, in the UK it's Remembrance Sunday today, so lest we forget, remember all those who have fallen in conflicts in history, and especially at the moment in Ukraine. I am particularly worried about the US's, both domestic political agenda. I think Project 2025 is going to be wholeheartedly endorsed. There's absolutely no doubt at the moment with the people who have been put in place, like Haman as well, who's coming on. He said, you ain't seen nothing yet, the amount of deportations you're going to get. So Project 2025 is going to happen, I think. So domestically, I'm worried about the US, but internationally, I'm really worried about the US. This kind of isolationism is not good for the world. Now, I'm not a massive fan of the US imperialism, but my goodness, I prefer the US to be dabbling internationally than China and Russia. It's just obvious. And so the US's desire, or the Trump administration's desire, to recede from assisting Ukraine is putting nails in Ukraine's coffin at the moment. Will Ukraine be able to survive on the back of continued European support? I guess we'll have to see. The Europeans are saying the right things and doing the right things to some degree. Is it enough? We can argue about that. Let me know what you think. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.